What up, African world? It's your boy Home Team here. I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And now that I've made my full transition into Patreon, you guys will be seeing more videos come out more frequently. So today, we're going to talk about Timbuktu under the Songhai Empire. So in my previous video on the Songhai Empire, I said that I would be discussing Ahmed Baba, and he was the greatest scholar of Timbuktu. But I wanted to give a little background first on the history of Timbuktu under the Songhai, as Timbuktu was, at its peak under the Songhai Empire. And I'll be taken from an article which I'll reference later concerning the topic of Timbuktu's autonomy. Basically, the autonomy of Timbuktu as an independent city outside the influence of Mali or Songhai has been, the dominant narrative. But, recent scholarship is seemingly challenging that idea and beginning to see that the Songhai Empire established its rule over Timbuktu, as it conquered the city and the territory, and that it was actually Gao that held a sort of ownership over Timbuktu, Gao being, the main headquarters of the Songhai. So let's begin. One of the more fascinating aspects of the history of Imperial Songhai, 1464 through 1591, concerns the nature of the relationship between the political center of the realm Gao and the fabled Timbuktu, the cultural, economic, and religious hub. Such fascination is a direct consequence of the manner in which Songhai primary sources were written. The authors of those 17th century documents employ as a principal theme the complex and somewhat delicate interaction between the Ulema, or the Muslim scholars of Timbuktu, and the Askias of Gao, pretty much the rulers of the Songhai Empire, the kings. To the extent that this theme receives far greater treatment in both length and detail than events at the royal court in Gao itself. To a large degree, contemporary or modern scholars today has uncritically subscribed to the 17th century chronicles depiction of Gao and Timbuktu relations. In fact, one can summarize the contemporary consensus view as follows. Pretty much modern day scholars say the preeminence of Timbuktu was such that not only did the city function autonomously, but it exerted considerable influence over Gao. The present study upon re-examination of primary sources will advance a proposal at variance with this view. First of all, it will be argued in this article that Timbuktu was not autonomous during the period of Songhai hegemony. Rather, the evidence would strongly suggest that Gao exerted sufficient control over Timbuktu to realize its original objectives for conquering the city. Secondly, it would appear that the idea of Timbuktu wielding political and religious powers of persuasion over Gao cannot be sustained by the historical data. On the contrary, a reprisal of the sources yields the finding that Gao was virtually free of any undue pressures from Timbuktu. The primary sources for this study are familiar to us and have been used once again. The primary sources and principles are the Tariq al-Fatash of Ibn al-Mukhtar and al-Sadi's Tariq al-Sudan. Regarding secondary literature, the works of J.O. Hunwick and Sekini Sissoko are indispensable in any attempt to understand Songhai history and are utilized frequently. The weakening of Mali towards the end of the 14th century greatly stimulated the interest of several entities in the commercially active Middle Niger area. But as Malayan influence over the area waned, the importance of Timbuktu as a leading center for the trans-Saharan trade steadily grew. Founded by elements of Musufa Sanhaja, the city had experienced two major phases of settlement. The first had been settlers arriving from the south, mostly from Dia, and the north, primarily from Tadmeka. The second phase saw the establishment of a large population which included immigrants from the more established trading centers of Walata and Gao. Now, near the dawn of the 15th century, Timbuktu had surpassed Walata as a commercial power and had eclipsed Dia as an intellectual center. The growth of the city combined with an eclipsed Mali resulted in at least one incursion by the Maasai sometime during the last quarter of the 14th century. The Maasai, inhabitants of the lands to the south of the Niger Bend, elected to leave Timbuktu after plundering and burning the city, and Mali was able to re-establish its already tenuous hold on the center. Nominal Malayan claims to Timbuktu were abruptly ended with the installation of Tuareg domination, beginning in 1433 and ending in 1468. It is during the Tuareg period that the leadership of the Timbuktu scholarly community shifted from the Sudanese to the Sanhaja Berber immigrants from the southern Sahara who settled in the Sankore quarter of the city. Three Sanhaja families in particular rose to prominence. The Akit family would provide Timbuktu with quadis, or judges, throughout the 16th century, while promoting the economic health of the city through close association with the merchant community. While the available data would suggest a commercially vibrant city under the domination of the Tuareg, it would appear that the new overlords were unable to fill the void created by the Malayan focal shift to the southwest. The probable Maasai incursion into the area around 1446, while directed towards Walata, is an indirect indication of Tuareg inability to establish uncontested control over Timbuktu. Subsequent expansion by Songhai underscores both the desirability and vulnerability of the Middle Niger. Malayan weakness had already precipitated a major Songhai expedition into Mima sometime during the middle of the 15th century. Under Sunni Ali, the Songhai threw all of their energies into expanding beyond their traditional homeland, an area stretching from Gao, Kikuya, south to the current Niger-Nigeria boundary. For nearly 3 decades, Sunni Ali waged incessant war upon the peoples of the Middle Niger until he brought the area under his control. By the time of his death, Imperial Songhai comprised a broad diversity of ethnic groups: Fobe, Fulani, Soninka, Tuareg, Sanhaja, Dogon, Bambara, and Bozo. He had succeeded in creating what J.O. Hunnewit calls a cordon sanitaire to the north of the Middle Niger Valley to guard against the Saharan Tuareg, and also to the south, approaching the borders of the Maasai. But the crowning achievement was to secure Timbuktu and Djenné. Between 1468 and 1473, and the jewel of the crown was Timbuktu. By 1468, Timbuktu had surpassed Walata as a leading southern terminus for the trans-Saharan trading network. The principal export commodity was probably gold, obtained from the gold fields of Akan and Bure, and transported to Timbuktu, chiefly by Douala merchants. In addition to gold, however, the city's market supplied Sudanese slaves, cola nuts, hides, cotton goods, and grains. From the north, they imported salt, horses, North African and European luxury items, weapons, and cowries for distribution throughout the western Sudan and points further south. In that direction, its commerce was assured by the inland delta or floodplain of the Niger stretching down to Djenné, the great commercial and cultural capital of the Douala, with a history going back beyond the 8th century. At either end of this corridor, the two cities constituted the commercial heart of the Western Sudan, which the Songhai rulers controlled throughout the 16th century. The corridor's need for security serves as sufficient explanation for much of imperial policy. Having acquired Timbuktu, however, Sani Ali quickly lost it in the sense that the commercial advantages concocted with control of the city ceased to occur. The evidence would suggest that Timbuktu fell into economic decline due to the abandonment of the center by the merchant community. Since 1433, these merchants had prospered under an arrangement with the Tuareg overlords. According to this agreement, Muhammad Nadi, a member of one of the leading merchant families, had assumed the title of Timbuktu Khoi and was apparently successful in mitigating Tuareg influence in the internal affairs. The Sankore community of scholars, by virtue of their affinity with the retreating Tuareg, fled the city in stages. The displacement of this community from Timbuktu was accompanied by the flight of business to other centers throughout the Western Sudan, so that Sani Ali's purpose became frustrated. His mistake in precipitating this exodus would not be repeated by other succeeding rulers. The advent of Muhammad Toure, or Askia the Great, to power, and the start of the Askia dynasty marked the beginning of a bold initiative for the Songhai. Having deposed of Sani Ali and his lawful heir, his son, by dubious means, Askia the Great, or Muhammad Toure, set out not only to restore order to the Middle Niger, but also to revive the prosperity of Timbuktu and Jenne by encouraging the return of the exiles to Timbuktu. To have accomplished this feat would have been impressive in itself, but apparently Askia and his ambition knew no bounds, for during his tenure he attempted to control as wide an expanse of territory as possible and was successful in extending the limits of Songhai hegemony deep into the Sahara to the north, to the west as far as the Senegal confluence, and east into the city-states of Hausaland, where he and succeeding Askias experienced considerable resistance from the likes of Zaria, Kano, Katsina, and Kebbi, and where they waged an indeterminate struggle with Bornu to influence the remaining Hausa polities. Between 1499 and 1510, Bagana, Diala, Futakingu, the salt mines of Tagaza, Agadez, and probably Takeda all fell in rapid succession. Only the Maasai states to the south were able to protect their territorial integrity. At the height of Songhai expansion, some 500,000 square miles inhabited by various peoples had been subdued, and that largely achieved by Askia. To dominate this vast stretch of land was to control the far-flung network of trade routes and mineral deposits throughout the western Sahel and Savannah, and it would not be implausible to conclude that the overarching concern of Songhai imperial policy was the security and expansion of commercial networks across the west central Sudan. It is in this context that we may approach the issue of Timbuktu's autonomy under the Askias in the 16th century. According to the Tariq al-Fatash of Ibn al-Mukhtar, Timbuktu enjoyed the privilege of self-government throughout the 16th century, free from the intervention of Songhai rulers at Gao. And indeed, at that time, Timbuktu had no authority except for the authority of divine law, and there was no ruler in it. The Quadi was a ruler, and in his hand was the power to loose and to bind. In support of this claim is the considerable weight of contemporary scholarship. Elias Saad's important contribution to the history of Timbuktu has at its central thesis the assertion that the city resisted external influence throughout its history and was especially successful in doing so under Imperial Songhai. During this period, Timbuktu was part of the Songhai Empire but was not strictly ruled or dominated by the Songhai. While disagreeing with Saad on other matters, Nehemiah Lesvenzion concurs with the notion of Timbuktu's autonomy when he writes, and I quote, "Under the Askia Muhammad and his successors, the Qadis held real authority in Timbuktu and seem to have been more influential than the governor of Timbuktu. The Qadi acted independently and even prevented messengers of the Askia from carrying out their duties in the city." Finally, there is the conclusion of J.O. Hunwick, who says, "It was perhaps during the 16th century that Timbuktu enjoyed its greatest degree of independence and also of security, though an integral part of the Songhai Empire, with a governor, the Timbuktu Khoi, appointed by the Askia as well as other officials of secondary importance, and a tax collector and a military commander at nearby Kabara, the city, through the enormous prestige of its Qadi and the veneration in which its scholars and holy men were held, managed to be virtually self-governing and to be sheltered from arbitrary exactions by either Songhai officials or desert dwellers." Thus, the issue of Timbuktu's autonomy during the 16th century has up to now received consistent treatment and a consistent narrative. It would appear, however, that there are two features of Imperial Songhai which contradict this popular narrative. The first concerns the nature of Songhai administration. The second relates to the specific issue of fiscal policy. With regard to the former, Timbuktu's individual profile is somewhat complex, and a review of Imperial Songhai governance is necessary to establish the proper context. According to Hunwick, Songhai was divided into two types of territory: the nuclear empire, consisting of original Songhai territory, plus lands added by Sunni Ali, and Greater Songhai, comprising all territories acquired by Askia Muhammad, or Askia the Great. The nuclear empire was composed of at least 11 major provinces, each governed by an official directly appointed by the Askia. This is in contrast to the administration of Greater Songhai, in which indigenous officials were retained as administrators. Certain provincial governors enjoyed special privileges, and it can be deduced that their posts were among the most important in the empire. One was the Dendi Fari, the governor of the southlands of the Niger, below Kukuya, who was distinguished by special apparel and the right to speak frankly to the Askia. Others included the Benga Farma, the Durma Khoi, and the Bara Khoi, three governors stationed north of the inland Niger Delta. Scattered throughout Songhai were officials whose designations included the Songhai term Mondio or Mundi, which means inspector. In some instances, these persons were responsible for tax collection. Other important posts included that of the High Khoi, or commander of canoes, who apparently supervised both commercial and military traffic along the Niger, a fact underlying the importance of water communications in Songhai. And the Tondi Farma, who most likely governed the Hambori region within the Niger Buckle. securing the overland route between Gao and the inland delta, as well as protecting the southern frontier against Maasai incursion. The Fari Mundio, or inspector of fields, was probably in charge of assessing land taxes, while the Kori farmer oversaw matters relating to the Tuareg and Arab populations. Having established a general picture of Songhai administration, we can return to the specific problem of Timbuktu. The present study proposes that the city maintained a dual administration, an imperial arrangement with the clear lines of authority leading directly to the Askia and Gao, and a municipal government under the authority of the Quadi. Concerning the imperial government, the Timbuktu Khoi headed the delegation. As was previously discussed, the office had enjoyed independence under Tuareg domination, but it became part of the Songhai government from the time of Sani Ali. Following the Timbuktu Khoi was the Timbuktu Mundio, possibly charged with collecting city revenues. Beyond these two officials were the Yubi Khoi, commissioner of the market, and the Ashar Mundio, perhaps the chief of police, and the Koira Banda Mundio, who had some supervisory capacity with respect to outlying areas. Together with the Timbuktu Khoi and Timbuktu Mundio, these three posts constituted the imperial administration at Timbuktu. The various quarters and ethnic groups of the city were headed by minor officials, such as the Barbush Mundio, supervisor of the Arab Berber within the city confines, and the Magsharan Khoi, administrator of the Tuareg north of Timbuktu. It is important to bear in mind that the Timbuktu Jenne Continuum was part of the western half of the empire, which in turn was governed by the Kanfari or Kurmini Fari, an officer second only to the Askia. Askia the Great created the post in 1494, and it was filled by his brother, Umar Tendurma. Strategically placed between Timbuktu and Jenne, was chosen as the Kanfari's headquarters. Further underscoring the importance of the Niger corridor was an administrative structure at Kabara, Timbuktu's river port. The port town was governed by two officials, the Balama, who presumably commanded a military garrison, and the Kabara Farma, a probable collector of custom dues. The crucial importance of securing the Timbuktu Jenne region clearly led to the formation of the imperial administrative structure of the Songhai. In addition to the forces under the Balama, there is evidence that the Timbuktu Khoi controlled some 3,000 horsemen and a substantial number of foot soldiers, not to mention the Kanfari's ability to field large forces in time of need. It is beyond the limits of credulity to propose that the Askias would maintain such an impressive array of officials and military potential if they did not fully intend to control the corridor. Notwithstanding the foregoing, it is undeniable that the Quadi at Timbuktu exercised appreciable power. As was true at Jenne, the Timbuktu Quadi was responsible for adjudicating cases on the basis of Islamic law. Sa'ad ventures beyond this narrow definition of function, arguing that the Quadi was the virtual leader of the city in conjunction with others of the scholarly community. The Jama, or Association of the Learned, enjoyed incomparable prestige among the city's inhabitants by virtue of their scholarship, piety, and wealth, the last in turn being further evidence of their baraka. The influence resort The influence resulting from all of these factors meant that the Quadi wielded a form of political administrative authority which transcended the limits of the few posts under his direct control. There were certain qualifications which the Timbuktu Quadi had to meet. Obviously, he had to be erudite. He needed to possess an intimate knowledge of the city. To place him above suspicion of accepting bribes and to ensure implementation of his fatwas or legal decisions, he had to enjoy sufficient means of influence. Most importantly, he needed the approbation of the Ulema. The office was controlled by members of the Akit family after the demise of Sani Ali, during whose tenure Habib had served as Quadi. Given both the stature of the Quadi and the existence of an imperial staff in and around Timbuktu, the lines of authority are not readily apparent. In response to this difficulty, the scholar Sissoko has argued that the Timbuktu imperial officials actually answered to the Quadi, and yet two separate passages in the Tariq al-Fatash suggest, among other things, that the imperial administration was in fact under the direct control of the Askia. In the first instance, the author writes that the Quadi Mahmud, upon vehemently disagreeing with an imperial directive, commenced to beat and expel from the city the representatives of the Askia. What is instructive here is not that the Quadi had the nerve and ability to rebuff Gao in so rude a fashion, but that the imperial agents were attempting to carry out the express wishes of the Askia in defiance of the Quadi. This supports the notion of a dual administration, despite some scholars' interpretation of the incident to the contrary. The second bit of evidence emanates from the reign of Askia Dawood. Ibn al-Mukhtar implies that the Askia visited Timbuktu on a regular basis and that he had prescribed an itinerary. It was his custom first to visit the Yubo Khoi, the Timbuktu Khoi, the Barbush Mundio, and the Koira Banda Mundio in the Balma Diendi quarter of the city. It was after conferring with the imperial staff that he went on to seek an audience with the Quadi, after which he greeted the Ulema at the Grand Mosque and then returned to Balma Dindi, where he held audiences with the merchants and other notables. The pattern of royal visits clearly demonstrates the administrative dichotomy within the city, just as the fact that Askia Dawood frequented the city indicates, in conjunction with the considerable presence of the imperial staff and military, his keen interest in closely monitoring the affairs of Timbuktu. The existence of officials exclusively loyal to Gao while residing in Timbuktu further militates against the concept of the city's independence. Consideration of imperial fiscal policy renders the idea even more improbable that Timbuktu had considerable power or influence over Gao, or Songhai imperialism. For a proper evaluation of the evidence in this regard, it is necessary to attempt the passage through the murky waters of Songhai taxation practices. So guys, this was a pretty long review concerning Timbuktu under Songhai imperialism, and so we're going to continue on to part 2, and that vid is coming up soon, so just stay tuned, and I hope you guys learned something and enjoyed this discussion, or this new narrative in a sense, between the relationship of Timbuktu and Gao. And so we're going to continue later, and stay tuned guys. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.